Hi, folks. So it's just me tonight doing a live stream. I had a big trip in Sacramento, got arrested live streaming the week 6 of the Poor People's Campaign. They did a disruption in 3 different places: the state assembly, the state senate, and in front of the governor's office. I was not intending to get arrested. I knew that if I got arrested, I was supposed to go to the 9 a.m. meeting, the training that they were going to have, and my companions and I, who drove up to Sacramento, decided to spend the night midway, and so there was no way we could get there at 9 o'clock. We didn't want to get arrested. I just wanted to live stream it. So when we got there midday, I saw the group that was doing the training, and I let them know that I would be following them into the building to cover what they had planned. And I still didn't really know what they had planned, but I knew that I was going to be there to document it. In the meanwhile, I live streamed some amazing speeches and interviewed Jovanka Beckles, who had come up to show solidarity with the Poor People's Campaign. This was the final week, and people had been going up there for 40 days every Monday, doing a different action and a different theme. And I had not been up there, although I did interview the California organizer, Kate Ziegler, on my show the night before the very first action up there. But I felt like I wanted to go up there also to show solidarity and to show the stream. And like I said, I had no intention of being arrested. And when I went into, the Senate gallery, everything seemed very pleasant. I started to interview someone up there, got a nice little couple-minute interview with her. And then the first thing I was told, I couldn't interview in there. And I said, I don't understand the problem. I'm talking in a normal tone of voice, just like anybody who's having a conversation in here. What's the problem? And of course, I'm sorry, you just can't interview in here. So I sat down in my chair in the gallery, which is on a level that's above the where the senators sit, which is below. And I was sitting across from the guys who were going to be doing the disruption. So once they started, I turned on my camera and I started live streaming, and then I was very quietly live streaming. And after just a short amount of time, maybe just a couple of minutes, the security officer came up to me and said, "Oh, you can't, you have to leave." And I'm like, "Why do I have to leave?" And she said, "Well, because you're causing a disruption." I said, "I'm not causing a disruption. I'm not saying a word. They're causing the disruption." And it's so funny because somebody who looked at my live stream said, "Notice at 4 minutes, 12 seconds in, the police officer pointed you out to the private dick." That was the term she used, the private dick. I guess he was the security guy who then came over to talk to me. And so they basically targeted me first because I was live streaming. And I just, I said, "No, I'm not going to stop. I have the First Amendment right. I'm press." And they said, "I don't care. This is an unlawful assembly. I said, "I'm not assembling. I'm press." And it didn't matter that he actually did ask me for my credential. And I don't have an official, press pass. When people ask for me for that, I always say, the First Amendment is my press pass, which I got from Occupy when we talked about the First Amendment is our permit. We don't need a permit to occupy public space. They said, "Well, we're going to ask you one more time and then you're going to be..." Oh, and then so the officer came over, this jerk. He came over and said, "Okay, then we're going to arrest you." And I'm like, "Fine, arrest me." And I swear to God, I had no intention of being arrested for the Poor People's Campaign. But at this point, I felt like the principle was the First Amendment and freedom of the press and freedom of speech and freedom of assembly and nonviolent civil disobedience and, my right to document this and show this to the people. So basically, they put me in handcuffs with my purse attached to my handcuffs. And that was kind of dragging me down because it was a very heavy purse. And sort of drew me to the front of the room where I guess they were going to wait and get other people and then bring them out. And the plastic handcuffs were a little tight. And at a certain point, I started to feel like my circulation was getting cut off. And it was probably the only point that I actually panicked during the whole thing, because I really did feel like blood was getting cut off. And I said, "This is too tight. This is too tight." And he said, "Well, next time maybe you won't get arrested," or something like that. Not that this is anywhere near the seriousness of it, but the first thing that came to my mind was Eric Garner, "I Can't Breathe." And I said something about that. And I started screaming. "Ben Allen, it's Lauren Steiner. I'm up here being arrested for live streaming." Because Ben Allen is my state senator and he knows me, and I assumed he was down there. And the guy says, "Be quiet, you're embarrassing yourself." And so then Kate Ziegler, bless her heart, she is the California organizer for the Poor People's Campaign. She looked at me and she said, "Lauren, just relax. This is not about us. This is about the cause. And we're just going to do what they tell us to do. And, if you relax your arm, it's not going to hurt so much." And so that's fine. I kind of calmed down. And then they took me down the hall and everybody was singing the different gospel songs and everybody was cheering and people were asking me, "Do you want to say what happened?" And I said what happened. I was just, arrested. All I was doing was streaming. Then they took us down in the elevator, and the people that I came with, Linda Bassett and Kristen Cox. Linda was following me and she was streaming. And it was so cute because they put me in this elevator and it went down one floor and the door opened and there she was. And when I saw her live stream, I saw that she was kind of walking down the stairs and she was there and the elevator opens and I see her and I'm like, and then she goes, "Okay, I'll go down to the basement." So they bring us down to the basement. And by this point, there's a lot more of us. And mostly there were women. There were a few men, but there were mostly women in our group. And there were a lot of pastors. It was very interesting because the Poor People's Campaign, for those of you who don't know, is the moral movement of our day. It's based on Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign that he was working on, a Poor People's March on Washington that he was working on when he was assassinated. So this was started by Reverend James Barber and some others in the South. We had a launch in downtown Los Angeles, in the Skid Row area, and I live streamed in a church all the speakers who were talking about what the Poor People's Campaign was going to be all about. And a lot of my friends got involved, and it's basically to end militarism, to end materialism, and to end, poverty and the war on the poor. So this obviously is adding a new component to it, the moral component. Like, is it moral for Jeff Bezos to make $233 an hour, $233,000 an hour for doing nothing when some people are trying to exist on $3 an hour? So clearly the answer is no. And why those sociopathic billionaires don't get that? Like, he's worth $110 billion. He could probably eliminate poverty around the world with that money, but that's not his first thought. No, his first thought is how he can beat back some little tax in Seattle that Shama Sawant and the other progressives on the city council imposed to fund programs for the homeless. This was the first time someone told me to spread my legs, and they patted me down and asked me if I had anything, metal or whatever. And then there was a very nice officer who put us in the van, and there were like 11 of us in the van, and we started chatting. And I was sitting next to Reverend Janet McKethan, who I know from the Ocean Park Church here in Santa Monica, which is a multi-denominational, if you will, social justice church. And they have a lot of events there for the kinds of causes that I support. So we were talking, and I was hoping to have her on the show, but she's still up in Sacramento, very busy with a lot of things, about some of the things that she has done protesting poverty and injustice over the course of her lifetime. And we're about the same age, so we sort of compared notes about where we were in the 80s when churches were taking in refugees from the wars in Central America. I was running a little public access cable TV station in Lexington, Mass, where there were several churches. I remember specifically the Unitarian Universalist Church that was taking in the refugees, and she was here in California. So there's a long tradition, obviously, not just Martin Luther King, but, you know, of the social ministries that pastors can do. So we went to the CHP, the California Highway Patrol Office, where they put us at a bunch of tables, and I had a purse. Like a lot of other people who planned to get arrested, which was not me, did not take big bags or purses. And Kate Ziegler had a backpack. She was not planning to get arrested either. So they told me to take out what it would, you know, that thing could not fit in a little plastic bag that they were going to send with us to the county jail. Now, I had been told that if we were arrested, most likely we would be released. I mean, what happened in previous weeks, people were brought down to the basement by the Capitol Police, and they were just cited and released. So the next escalation would be for the CHP to bring us over to the CHP headquarters and cite us and release it. And they didn't do that. They told us that we were going to be booked in the county jail, and that there's so many of us, I think there were like 43 of us that got arrested, that it would take so much time to process us that we'd probably be in jail overnight. So I'm like, oh my God, because we were planning to go back to Los Angeles, Linda, Kristen, and I. So I was thinking, how do I get them a message? So I said, when do I get my one phone call? And they said, well, you get your phone call in the jail. And there was this one really nice officer, Officer Starr, who was very, you know, accommodating to me, as much as you could be accommodating to a prisoner or an arrested person. And he said, well, what do you want to take? And I said, well, I guess my wallet, my phone, and my keys. And they put it in the bag in front of me on the table. And I was sort of sitting at a table by myself because I was in the back row. And at some point I had to go to the bathroom, and they called the one woman officer to take me into the bathroom. So she brought me into the bathroom and cut the plastic cuffs, and there was still plastic around my wrist. So she took her metal cuffs that she had around her waist, her belt, and she put, you know, one end into this plastic and the other end into this plastic. And I had some flexibility with my hands. So I was actually able, I'm just showing you this, to take my hand like this in front of me, whereas most people, you know, had their hands stuck behind their back. So I can't believe I did this. So when I got to the table, I took my hand and I pulled my phone out, and I'm looking around, you know, seeing is anyone watching me. And I started, first I went to Facebook, and I typed in sitting in handcuffs, Kristen Cox, Linda Teach, because that's her name on Facebook, come to the jail. And so periodically I kind of kept looking at the phone to see if they got to me. And somebody posted on that thing, if you're in handcuffs, how are you texting? How are you typing? But I was able to do it. It's funny that I can make light of this now because, well, I mean, truly we were not roughed up. They treated us, for the most part, besides this DiMichele guy, they treated us very nicely and politely, and so differently from, I'm sure, how they treat poor people, people of color under normal circumstances. But then they took us around, I guess it was 6 o'clock. So we had been there and in the handcuffs for about 3 hours and 15 minutes. Then they took us over to the county jail, and we sat inside the county jail in a waiting area where we were waiting for a medical person. I don't know if she was a nurse or nurse practitioner, whatever she was, but she came and she did the blood pressure and she did the, you know, the temperature thing, the thermometer. And, you know, we were sitting and we were chatting. And so we asked when we were going to get food, and they said, you missed dinner. Food apparently is a choice of either a bologna, well, not a choice. It's either a bologna sandwich or a PB&J sandwich. So I didn't have lunch. And they told me at the CHP that they were going to throw away my banana. I said, can't I eat it? They said, no. And I was like, I don't think they could believe that I was asking the kinds of questions that I was asking in there. But, you know, I guess they humored me or whatever. And they said, no, we have to throw it out. I said, well, if I'm getting out in a few hours, can't you just leave it in my bag? And they said, no, because we're putting your bag in our locker and we can't have any perishables in there and we're going to have to throw out your drink. You know, I had some iced tea in there in my Bernie water bottle. Then they noticed that I had this ring and they said, how do you still have that ring? And I said, because that's my engagement ring. I'm not giving that ring up. I mean, it's a 2-carat diamond. I wasn't going to put it in my purse in some CHP thing, like not in my possession. In fact, I told them that, and I was thinking I probably should have, when I went to the bathroom, I probably should have put it in my underwear because they said, well, you know, they're going to take it from you there. And I said, well, why do they have to take it? And well, they said, well, it's the discretion of, you know, the deputy. So I then sat down. They brought us into a room in which they asked us a lot of questions, like what medications were we taking, and you know, were we suicidal, and questions like where were we born and whatnot. And apparently the others were told not to answer these questions. But then they said, you know, if you answer these questions, it'll be a lot quicker to process you because we can look all this stuff up. And anyway, I just decided myself that I was only going to answer questions that I found not objectionable. So I didn't have a problem telling them where I was born or what my social security number or medications or anything like that. So then they told me that now we're getting closer to going into the holding cell. And this is when the women took over. And I have to tell you, and I don't know if it's me, but the men yesterday or 2 days ago were much nicer than the women. I mean, these women, maybe it's because they're working in a male-dominated field or whatever, but they were such bitches, I gotta say. I mean, I couldn't say anything to them without them just like, stand here, go there, blah, 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 blah. And they do these like humiliating things like walk on this line and then walk 3 steps past and then turn around, and you know, you're just like this automaton. And that was the point at which they finally took off the cuffs. So this is maybe 5 hours we were in handcuffs, and I couldn't figure out why we had to be in handcuffs when we were in custody in a closed facility with, you know, many officers watching us. But I think it's just, you know, part of the process that they want to make things uncomfortable for you so you won't be a criminal, you know. And why they think that nonviolent civil disobedience is criminal is beyond me, but it is. And so there we were. So when we got into the holding cell, and they had obviously a women-owned holding cell, that's when things actually started to become a little bit fun, because we started singing songs and we started doing yoga stretches and we started, you know, making up fun little rhymes about our names and just kind of, you know, passing the time and getting to know each other. And, you know, fast forward, we got out, the women got out by right before midnight. So all told, we were in custody for about 10 hours. And then we were assuming that the men, you know, would come out right after us, but they didn't, because Jeremy White, who was with me, didn't come out until 6 p.m. the next day, which is crazy. And I haven't had a chance to talk to him about why he thinks they kept the men so long. They kept him for 27 hours, and we were in there for 10 hours. And so then we went back. Kristen's brother-in-law lives in Sacramento, so we spent the night there, got a good night's sleep, and went there the next morning. I did some interviews with some of my comrades who were in the holding cell with me, and then we came back to LA. I would say that they definitely targeted me because I was live streaming. I think that's wrong. I'm not going to make such a big deal about it because I think you guys all remember Dea Schlossberg, who is the documentarian who works with Josh Fox, how she was arrested back in September or actually October of 2016 because she was live streaming. They were shutting down the pipelines across the northern border of, you know, Canada and the United States at various locations. And she was actually charged with 3 felonies that carried a sentence of up to 45 years, causing Edward Snowden to tweet, hey, they only charged me with crimes for 30 years. And then, you know, she got the charges dismissed, as did 2 other, I'm going to look up their names right now, 2 other filmmakers, Lindsay Grazel and Carl Davis, who were arrested in Burlington while filming climate activist Ken Ward, also attempting to shut down the Trans Mountain pipeline. And I think you guys probably remember, Amy Goodman from when she was in the Standing Rock. She got arrested for trespassing. And then, of course, they dropped those charges. I was part of the Occupy movement. I never got arrested. I chose not to get arrested in any of the actions that some of my friends got arrested in. I always wanted to get arrested for protesting, but I was very specific about what I was going to get arrested for. And in my mind, what I wanted to get arrested for and what I've been trying to organize people to do is chain ourselves to the entrance of the Inglewood oil field where they're fracking in the largest urban oil field in North America. I organized like 36 protests since Occupy. And I kind of announced at the end of last year that I wasn't going to be organizing protests anymore. And in fact, I wasn't even going to be live streaming them because I just feel like they've lost their effectiveness. And everybody and their uncle is out there protesting, including the Mick resistance every week. So there's so many issues, and they've got us all and running in these different directions. And, I love to say that I was part of two social movements in my lifetime, the Occupy movement and the Bernie Sanders movement, which are multi-issue movements. And it seemed to me very efficient to work that way because it was basically the framing was the 99% versus the 1%. And almost all issues, except for certain issues relating to identity politics, can be categorized as the 99% versus the 1%. And I get myself into trouble all the time when I say identity politics is dividing the left, when all I mean to say is not that fighting for our specific identities is not super important, and that identity discrimination is not going to be cured if we eliminate economic discrimination, because that is, of course, not true. I mean, we just had, who was the basketball player, Sterling Brown, was that his name, who just got arrested and, made to go on the floor, on the ground. People of color are treated completely differently. And in my, my show with Jamal Thomas's show that I was on a couple of weeks ago, I talked about an incident in which I was, reaming this cop another asshole, basically. And if I were a Black person, I would have been shot pretty much at any moment during that entire interaction. But I just went, ballistic on this guy. And he was like calming me down and telling me that I ought to meditate. And it's just, it's total white privilege. And I get that. But I feel like that's what the Democratic Party loves to do. They love to play identity politics while they collude with the Republicans and the 1% to screw the 99%. So I really feel that we can keep two ideas in our head at one time. It's not a binary situation. We can still fight racial oppression and patriarchy and oppression against our LGBTQ members, and still also fight economic inequality. I ended up getting arrested for this, and it was a spur of the moment thing because the whole through line, I would say, of my career, of my work, paid or non-paid, has been citizen journalism. When I was in high school and college, I wanted to be a broadcast journalist because I thought that media, specifically television, was the most powerful vehicle for influencing public opinion and therefore affecting social change. And I wanted to be a broadcast journalist. And you're going to laugh when I tell you who inspired me was Barbara Walters and Geraldo Rivera. I mean, I grew up in New York, and in New York City, not in the city, but the New York City television stations were what I watched. And I remember that Barbara Walters interviewed Governor Rockefeller's wife about her breast cancer. And at that point, in the early 70s, cancer was something people were ashamed of. They didn't talk about it, much less on TV. Barbara Walters interviewed her, and she talked about how early screening mammograms could save lives. And the next day, 50,000 women made appointments for mammograms. And it was like, wow, And then, of course, Geraldo Rivera, before he became a Fox News nut job, was a reporter for Eyewitness News, and he covered the Willowbrook Mental Institution in Long Island. And that was an institution, when he went in there with his cameras, you could see people were sitting around in horrible conditions, sitting in their own urine, in their own feces. They were being abused by the supposed caretakers. And when these conditions were broadcast, the visual conditions were broadcast to the city, they shut down that institution. And that report was credited with leading to the shutting down of all these kind of inhumane, large-scale mental hospitals throughout the United States. And of course, Reagan, everybody remembers in the 80s, Reagan closed the mental institutions, and the idea was supposed to be that there would be halfway houses in the community to house people that had mental illnesses. But then the NIMBYs didn't want them in the community, just like now we have the NIMBYs here in Los Angeles, including on mynextdoor.com, where I'm constantly battling with them, not wanting the homeless shelters. And that's the problem. We all have to take care of each other. The things that I'm reading about, Sherman Oaks used to be such a classy place, and now we have all these drug addicts and homeless derelicts and people shooting up and hypodermic needles on the ground and feces on our front lawn. I mean, it's just like unbelievable, the heartlessness of these people and how they don't get it. They don't get the societal conditions that have led to homelessness, and they feel like it's somebody's personal failing. And I bet you a lot of these people would classify themselves as liberal Democrats if you ask them. I wanted to be a broadcast journalist. I saw how when Walter Cronkite turned against the Vietnam War, all of a sudden the rest of the nation did. But you know, at that point, we had 3 networks. That's all we had, 3 networks and PBS. And so everybody was watching the same stuff. And you could have sort of like a community national zeitgeist if you want. You could influence the national conversation through broadcast television. And also in those days, news was what was called a loss leader, meaning they didn't profit from the news divisions. It was just something they did as a public service. Because if you study broadcast law history, as I have, the FCC gives you a broadcast license to operate in the public interest, convenience, and necessity. And there are certain things that you have to do to keep that broadcast license. And over the years, they've gotten rid of mostly all of them. They've gotten rid of the fairness doctrine, which says you have to show both sides of an issue. They've gotten rid of the equal time rule, which says if you give one candidate airtime, you have to give the other candidate equal airtime. They've gotten rid of a lot of children's programming requirements, news requirements, or what they can what they can define as news. Then I wanted to be a broadcast journalist, but I moved to Boston and I was living with my friend and I was waitressing in Harvard Square, looking for my big breaks. Curious person that I was, I read the Real paper, which was one of the 2 alternative papers. Now that I don't even know if they have either of them. They had the Real paper and the Phoenix back in 1979. And I found out about this hearing for cable TV is coming to Boston. And I didn't even know what cable TV was. So I went to Faneuil Hall, I sat down and I listened. And there was a group of people from something called the Boston Cable Access Coalition. And that's when I found out what public access cable was, that it was the opportunity for citizens, ordinary citizens, to make their own media. And when the FCC originally instituted that rule back in 1972, all it was that the cable station had to give the citizen 5 minutes of live studio time. That was the regulation. But by the time the late 70s came around and they were starting to franchise all of the suburbs, because up until that point, they only needed cable in rural areas where you couldn't get reception, and urban areas like Manhattan and LA, where they had tall buildings that blocked, the broadcast signals. But then, HBO went up on the bird, the satellite, we call it the bird. And all of a sudden, there's now different kinds of programming other than, just rebroadcasting broadcast stations. The guy that I actually worked for, the very company was my first job, UA Columbia Cablevision, was the original behind home box office. And then he came up with the idea for C-SPAN and got all the other cable company operators to agree to fund C-SPAN, which they currently do today. And that's how we're able to watch the House and the Senate on cable TV and now on the internet. So they were going to franchise Boston. So all these cable companies were competing, and they basically had the same satellite services. They had the same technology, but where they were trying to compete was on public access. So one would say, well, I'll build 5 studios. Oh, I'll do better. I'll build 7 studios, and we'll throw in a mobile production van, and we'll have public access classes. And it was at this point that they had the Sony Portapack, which was, we think about how we can now do high definition video with something this small. Well, there used to be a Portapack, which is a big, pretty heavy, but obviously one person could carry it, a tape deck, if you will, that you put on your shoulder, and then a small little camera that you attach to the tape deck, and you could go around and do remote programming. We called it small format production equipment. So George Stoney from the Alternate Media Center in New York City sent out interns to different public access cities where they had public access studios to develop this capacity. And, by the time I got into it, 1979, 1980, it was crazy. When I was 24 years old, I was program director of a cable system in Lexington, Massachusetts. We had all of 7,500 subscribers in the town, but I was responsible for local origination, which was programming the cable company produced, public access, government access, education access. There were 3 access channels. And I developed a training course. Well, actually, I hired somebody. I had like 3 employees. I think there were 4 paid staffers, and I had about 12 to 15 interns at any one time. And eventually we trained about 200 community producers. And I thought it was the greatest thing. When I found out about it, it was like, what? Are you telling me that an average citizen can make their own media without having it filtered through a reporter, an editor, a producer? That's great. Sign me up. And when I was doing these programs back in the early 80s, we did need a crew. I mean, you needed about 9 people to produce the kind of show that I produced right now, sitting here by myself in my guest room, with my desktop. So, I mean, it's pretty amazing how far things have come. But also in those 40 years, we have seen the rise of neoliberalism. We have seen television news become no longer a loss leader, but a profit center. And when it becomes a profit center, it's all about how many ads they can sell. And that's all based on what they think the viewer wants. And they think the viewer wants junk. And then the viewer starts wanting junk because that's all they get. And then it becomes this circular kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. So when you take what's happened to the media, and when you take what's happened to education, and now I'm kind of tying it into the title of my live stream, which is The Death of Democracy, you need certain things in order to have a democracy. You need to have educated citizens who are informed about what's going on in their communities, who can influence their representatives, because we live in a representative democracy, to make decisions that are responsive to them. So do we have that? No, we don't have that anymore because, first of all, education has become privatized and corporatized. I'm not going to go into my whole spiel about charter schools, but anybody who follows me knows that I think charter schools are extremely dangerous. And I don't care if they're for-profit or non-profit, as long as they're privately run and not accountable to a locally elected public body, they are private. They are causing, a whole plethora of bad effects, not the least of which is the death of critical thinking. And if you don't teach critical thinking, then you don't teach people how to question authority. And if you don't question authority, then you're just an obedient cog in the capitalist system, just working and buying, and slowly having your rights eroded and slowly having the planet killed, which is where we find ourselves today. So if you don't have the education and you don't have the media that's providing you the information that you need to make decisions in a democratic society, we lose our democracy. Now, a lot of people feel, and I would probably agree with them, that we already have lost our democracy, that we actually live in an oligarchy because it's the wealthy few that actually run things because they have bought our government. And that leads to what I wanted to talk about, what happened with net neutrality today. But and what we can do about it. Maybe we can't do anything about it. I seem to be getting more discouraged as things go along. I mean, the only thing good news that happened today was that Trump was pressured by everybody, you know, Bernie Kratz, Hillbots, Republicans, everybody, athletes. I mean, you have people I'm reading about, Seth MacFarlane, Steve Levitan, Judd Apatow, people that do shows with Fox, basically tweeting that they're going to cut their ties with Fox because Fox is, you know, the media arm of the Trump presidency. Now, of course, they can say this because now they know Fox is being spun off. Oh, these Democrats are cheering. Oh, we were able to shut down. Jeff Sessions was trying to do antitrust against the AT&T Time Warner merger. Well, let me tell you something. That was a good lawsuit. Not that I'm a fan of Jeff Sessions, but we don't need more consolidation of media in this country. That's been the problem with it. The fewer voices we have, the less information we get, and the more uniform the information is. They shut down that merger, and the next thing you know, Fox now has its properties for sale. They want to keep the news division, they want to keep the station group, and they want to keep one other piece of their business. But the studio and the television production company, they want to sell off. So it's very easy for these guys to come out after all these years. And by the way, Obama too, and I'm going to put an article in the comments. It's Jeremy Scahill's The Intercepted. We listened to it on the car ride home from Sacramento, in which he shows that the ACLU made some complaints against Homeland Security for the abuse and neglect of children between the years of 2009 and 2014. So this is Obama, friends. And they actually, Jeremy Scahill actually talks about how immigration policy was much better under Reagan and Bush than it was under Obama. Now, of course, the policy that Trump ended was new to him. This policy of actually separating children from their parents, which is child abuse. I mean, don't get me wrong. There's no way you can defend something like that. I mean, it is child abuse. It causes trauma. And I learned from one of the ministers in jail that trauma actually, not only does it imprint on your own brain, it gets into your DNA. Told me of a very interesting experiment with rats and wintergreen. They had the smell of wintergreen, which they would spray whenever they were shocking rats. And it got to the point where they didn't even have to shock the rats. They would spray the wintergreen and the rats would recoil. And guess what? The offspring of the rats had the same response to wintergreen. And I was like, oh my God. And because we were talking about generational trauma in the cell the other night. Very interesting night in the cell. You know, when you're arrested with educated people, you learn a lot of things. But, you know, you can also learn a lot of things from poor uneducated people, too. And there were a couple of people in our cell, and we see the kinds of things that they get arrested for and held in jail for. And that's what we were there for, fighting, bearing witness to, because, you know, people were saying, why aren't there more poor people here? Well, poor people can't afford to take the day off from work to drive up to Sacramento to protest. Anyway, back to the democracy versus the oligarchy. So we live in an oligarchy, but now the question is, are we going to fascism? Are we going to have such an authoritarian society where they're just going to be telling us what to do and we're following orders because we don't think critically and we don't question authority? I'm worried about that, quite frankly. And this whole idea with net neutrality, you know, net neutrality to me, and why I spent, 3 years of my life fighting to get the Obama administration to institute the net neutrality rules that he finally instituted, was exactly because of the same thing that caused me to want to be a broadcast journalist. I feel it's important to give people the information they need to make decisions in a democratic society, which is why I do so many shows on legislation. Why I did my show last week on the Farm Bill and the draconian cuts to food stamps. Why I did the show the week before on the deregulation, regionalization of the electric grid in California, which is going to lead to more dirty energy being used and more privatization, like the Enron scheme. So because the broadcast stations aren't covering this, because the newspapers are barely covering this, I feel like I'm interested in policy. I was interested in policy in college, try to unpack policy and legislation for my viewers and at least tell them, call your representative tomorrow, tell them to vote no on the farm bill, tell them to vote yes on 822, the net neutrality bill. I mean, I feel like if you're not going to be able to be a full-time activist like I and so many other people are that I know, and you're working one job, two jobs, whatever, and all you can do is make a call, you need to make that call. And I want to provide you with the information so that that call is easy for you. So what happened today with net neutrality, Scott Weiner had this bill, and we fought his terrible housing bill, 827, but his net neutrality bill was actually the strongest in the nation. It was actually stronger than the regulations that the FCC finally adopted in 2014. And it kind of sailed through the state Senate without being amended. And we were all calling our state senator and saying, you know, vote for 822 without amendments, and it happened. And, you know, I should have been smarter. I should have known, because this is exactly what happened with SB 562. I should have known they were going to kill it in the assembly. I mean, those telecoms were quietly working behind the scenes to influence the corporate Dems, the mod Dems in the assembly. The very first committee that this came up in front of was called the Communications and Conveyance Committee, and it's headed by Miguel Santiago. Now, that name is known to me because I spoke at the Students' March last year, and that Students' March featured him. He was one of the speakers also. He was talking about his bill that got passed to provide 1 year of free community college in California. So I'm thinking, oh, this guy is a good guy. Of course, it's not enough. We need 4 years of state universities and public like the state schools, the Cal States and the UCs. They need 4 years free. But, this is a start, incrementalism, But now I see that he is the guy, and we don't find out about this until like yesterday when Evan Greer from Fight to the Future, who's been writing in Medium, God knows why he keeps writing in Medium. I keep inviting him on my show. I say, I got all these activists watching me. I'd love for you to come and do my show and keep us updated on what's happening with this thing, because he's the policy wonk. He really understands this stuff. And I'm going to, in fact, have to go read to you his article in Medium to tell you exactly what Miguel Santiago did, because I can't wrap my head around a lot of the technical stuff. So Scott Weiner had this bill. It passed the state Senate. It was going to the state assembly today to this committee. The legislators found out that that the telecoms were starting to lobby, and they were starting to tweet to the representatives on that committee, and they were buying ads on social media to try to weaken it. And so Kevin De Leon, who is in the runoff against Dianne Feinstein for Senate, had his own net neutrality bill that wasn't quite as good as Scott Weiner's bill. But they decided to combine their bills because they got wind that the telecoms were going to pit one bill off against the other and therefore have no bills. So they decided to combine their bills. But what ended up happening was even worse. Miguel Santiago came up with his own amendments, and here's what they are. So they bucked standard procedure. They railroaded this a vote through without even allowing the author, Scott Weiner, to make a presentation, without even hearing public comment by the public. And they voted even before the committee meeting began. Weiner said with the new amendments, the bill was now mutilated and a fake net neutrality bill. And this vote passed 8-0 with 2 abstentions, and all the Democrats joined the Republicans to eviscerate this bill. And as Evan Greer says, making them the first Democrats to actively help the Trump administration dismantle net neutrality. And he goes on, the level of corruption we just witnessed literally makes me sick to my stomach. These California Democrats will go down in history as among the worst corporate shills that have ever held elected office. Californians should rise up and demand that their assembly members represent them. What do you think we've been trying to do, Evan? The actions of this committee today are an attack not just on our net neutrality, but on democracy. Despite thousands of phone calls from constituents and letters from leader Nancy Pelosi and Representative Anna Eshoo, Chairman Santiagos' amendments to SB 822 will leave the bill gutted and here's the stuff that I don't necessarily understand entirely, but I'm going to read it to you. Allow ISPs, internet service providers, to charge websites and small businesses access fees just to reach their customers and block any website or service that doesn't pay the fee. Allows ISPs to circumvent net neutrality protections at the point where data enters the network. Thus, instead of blocking a website as it is transported over the ISP's network, the ISP can just block it as it enters the ISP's network. Allows ISPs to throttle entire classes of applications. Example, all online gaming or all online voice calls. Remember that AT&T was previously busted blocking iMessage. Allows ISPs to zero rate their own content, i.e. AT&T can incentivize you to watch CNN, which they now own, or Comcast can make it free for you to go to NBC's website while making you use your data to get your news elsewhere. Allows ISPs to charge service fees in exchange for zero rating them, giving large corporations a huge unfair advantage over startups and small businesses. Share this widely so people know that these politicians sold us out. Then contact your members of Congress to demand they restore net neutrality at the federal level. So now I'm having kind of a hard time understanding where we are in California, because it seems to me that the entire assembly needs to vote on this. And if we can get to the entire assembly, we might be able to fix it. But Scott Wiener was not answering his tweets. He tweeted out 5 hours ago, our net neutrality bill, SB 822, was gutted today by the Assembly Communications Committee. Before I was allowed to present the bill and before public comment, the eviscerated bill was passed over my objection. California should lead on net neutrality, not pass a toothless bill. And then he has his statement, which he says, what happened today was outrageous. After the Senate passed SB 822 with strong net neutrality protections, the Assembly Committee forced hostile amendments into the bill before even holding a hearing, before taking any public comment, and only 12 hours after making those amendments public. These hostile amendments eviscerate the bill and leave us with a net neutrality bill in name only. In negotiations leading up to the committee hearing, I expressed a willingness to negotiate the provisions of the bill, and I remain willing to negotiate, but I can't support a weak version of net neutrality that eliminates critical provisions. He doesn't say this in the statement, but I understand that he tried to withdraw his bill and they wouldn't let him. I'm proud to stand with a broad coalition of labor, media, anti-poverty, social justice, consumer, and business organizations, as well as elected leaders, including Senator Kevin DeLeon, in fighting for net neutrality. California should lead by example and enact the strongest net neutrality protections in the country. Passing a weak neutered bill is exactly the wrong direction for our state. And let me let you know that I also asked Scott Wiener to come on my show while this thing was going through the state Senate, spoke to his communications director who said he would talk to him about it, and then nobody ever got back to me. So one kind of has to wonder, how serious he was about this, because we know, or we suppose, that Kevin DeLeon, one of the reasons he fought so hard for SB 562 was that he knew that it was going to go down in the assembly. So, with Scott Wiener being in the pocket of real estate developers, I really have to wonder. There's a little part of me that's kind of cynical about his statement here, especially when he's not getting back to people and they're tweeting him, what can we do? What can we do? Can we still save it? So Mashable wrote an article which kind of connects the dots here to our congressmen and legislators being bought and paid for, in which they show that Santiago's fifth largest donor is AT&T, and he has received over $43,000 from the telecom services and equipment industry over his 4-year-long career as an assemblyman. AT&T also provided a charity in Santiagos district with a giant check for $750,000. So let me see. I'm going to click that hyperlink because we know, as we've been lobbying for various things, that a lot of nonprofits come in And when it's time for public comment, they're defending horrible companies like Comcast or Wells Fargo. Let's see, ProMesa Boyle Heights to help students in their quest to graduate with $75,000 from AT&T to Proyecto Pastoral. There you go. I mean, this guy is in the pocket, and somebody was tweeting we should support his opponent in November, but this guy sounds like kind of a nothing. But again, folks, this is going to take a concerted, strategic effort. And if you watched my show a couple of weeks ago about the election, primary recap, lessons learned, you'll know that I think that we need to be a lot more strategic. And the problem with the left being strategic is that we're all over the place, and everybody wants to lead their own organization, and everybody has their own opinion about how to get things done. And the right wing is very united, because they're authoritarian and they can follow the leader and they do what they're told. And, they're riding roughshod all over the rest of us while we're sitting here debating everything. So, yeah, critical thinking, questioning authority, that's all good. There's a good side of that, but the bad side of that is it's often hard for us to agree, to strategize, to organize, to come up with a program. So I'm going to be working, for the next few months on these candidates that I've identified. But as far as, this situation goes, I'm very worried about what's happening with net neutrality. I'm very worried what's happening with arresting and prosecuting journalists. And I do see that if climate change doesn't kill us, fascism is going to. And I think we just have to keep fighting. I don't know what else to say, but at the very least, we should support the Poor People's Campaign. This is just the start of what is going to be a multi-issue campaign, and they are forming a fusion coalition, which is different from a more transactional coalition, like we have Justice LA. Oh, by the way, they had a defeat last night because the Los Angeles Board of Supervisors decided to accept the environmental impact report on the $2.5 billion jail. They want to build this big mental health jail, tear down the men's jail, and then spend another $1 billion building a women's jail out in Lancaster. But the idea is to, instead of putting the money into building more jails, to put it into services for the homeless, for the mentally ill, for drug users, because that's who's taking up the biggest percentage of our jail beds. So having gone, I had a great tweet, one of my more shared tweets, retweeted tweets, I guess you say. I wrote, from Facebook jail to real jail, because I've been put in Facebook jail for sharing my shows. I mean, not even any of my protests, just my shows. I shared my primary recap show in 6 groups before they put me in Facebook jail for 7 days. And somebody said maybe it's because I shared the YouTube video that I edit all my shows to get rid of the bloopers and to make them shorter and stuff. And I put it on YouTube and I shared the YouTube video, and Facebook doesn't like to share anything that's not Facebook. So maybe that was the reason. But regardless, I mean, I think we should nationalize Facebook. Of course, that's never going to happen, but at the very least, we've got to figure out how to get them to stop censoring people, because this is how we all get our news and information. I was telling the guys that I drove up to Sacramento with that I'm unsubscribing to all my email from organizations, because I figure if it's worth seeing, my friends are going to post it on Facebook. So it's very dangerous, when Facebook becomes your only source of news and information. Of course, they're just the platform. They're not writing the articles, but who knows? That could be next. Anyway, I think I've kind of talked this subject to death tonight, what I want to talk about, which was, my arrest and the net neutrality bill. I'm going to be going to Washington, D.C. on Friday. I'm going to be covering the Poor People's March on the National Mall on Saturday with the big culmination of the actions for the past 6 weeks. I'm also going to be covering American Promise as an organization. They're doing a American Citizenship Leadership Conference. And it's all about the 28th Amendment, which should solve our problem because it's going to get money out of politics if we can ever get it passed. So I'm going to be covering Nina Turner's dinner speech on Saturday night. I'm going to be getting an interview with Ben Cohen, and I'm going to ask him if he would take the glyphosate out of his ice cream, because he's great on campaign finance reform, but he's got to start using more organic milk in his ice cream. So I've got Ben Cohen, I've got Nina Turner. I'm hoping to get Francis Moore LaPay, of course, Jeff Clements from American Promise, and David Bonifaz, Free Speech for the People. Or is it John Bonifaz? Well, it's somebody Bonifaz. And then on Monday, there's going to be a citizen lobby day where we go to the offices of these representatives. And the final thing that I'm going to cover is 12 o'clock, this is Eastern time on Monday, Ted Deutsch, who's a congressman, is going to be doing a roundtable with the Parkland students. So I'm kind of excited about that, because when I was down in Florida visiting my mom, the same time that the shooting happened, I was trying to get interviews with them and I was unable to do so. So now I'll be able to hear what they have to say and maybe ask them some of my own questions. And then I'm going to take a couple weeks off to just get some vacation time here. But I will be back in mid-July. I'm going to have an interview with Ro Khanna. I'm going to sign off now, and you'll next see me Saturday from the National Mall for the Poor People's Campaign. Keep fighting.